So, thank you for coming out. So I'm going to start by reading the very beginning of the left-handed, well, I'll explain it and then I'll read a little bit of it. The Left-Handed Fate is set during the very beginning of the War of 1812. And it's an upper middle grade book, so, you know, upper, let's say, middle school is sort of the target age for this, although hopefully it'll appeal to adults as well. But we have two different crews. We have a British crew and an American crew. The British crew is a privateer crew, and they're hunting for the pieces of an engine that it is hoped will be able to end the wars in the Pacific. And at this point, Britain has been at war for about 30 years on and off, mostly with France. Of course, the war for independence in the U.S. happens during this time frame as well. So Lucy, who is one of the main characters, who's the daughter of a privateer, has literally never known a time without war. And she has a paying customer or a paying charter aboard this ship who believes he has the ability to put together an engine that will be essentially like a phenomenal doomsday weapon that will be able to end the wars in the Atlantic. And to that end, they've come to Baltimore for one of the pieces, but unfortunately, for various reasons, they get there just after war has been declared between Britain and the U.S., complicating life totally. And so this is the very beginning of the book. June 22nd, 1812. Baltimore was a beautiful, twinkling, probably hostile collection of lights up ahead, half hidden by two sheltering arms of land and one massive fortress. The topsail schooner Left-Handed Fate slid like an elegant knife through the water, trying as hard as ever she could not to look like a British privateer as she passed under the guns of Fort McHenry. The three youngest passengers stood at the port rail, leaning progressively farther out over the water in order to get a view unobstructed by someone else's head, until the tallest, a young man in spectacles and a blue velvet coat, shoved the leather portfolio he was holding into the hands of the girl in the middle, pivoted abruptly, and vomited over the side. "Is Max all right?" asked the smallest, a child with Chinese features, looking around the girl to give the older boy the briefest of looks. "Just committing his supper to the sea." After that, other than handing the portfolio back once the boy called Max had composed himself, Lucy Blue Crown ignored them both. Her eyes were on the fortress, and not all the vomiting landlubbers in the world were going to distract her from the hornet's nest they were sailing into. "There isn't even any sea running," the small boy protested. "This river's calm as glass." "Since when does he need a reason?" Lucy muttered. "I'm right here," Max said with wounded dignity, "and I'm not seasick, Lau." "Nerves, then," Lau said sympathetically, patting his arm. "I'd be an idiot not to be nervous," Max retorted. "Enough," Lucy said abruptly. The night was far too clear for this sort of adventure. He wanted dirty weather, clouds, mist, a good fierce soaking storm for sneaking in and out of unfriendly ports. But the weather hadn't chosen to cooperate, so here they were, the Fate and all the souls aboard her, waltzing toward the harbor of Fells Point as if it were the most natural thing in the world. So this is how the book begins, and we go from there. Of course, nothing is going to work out easily for these guys. Once they get to Baltimore, they manage to find some information, but not the piece that they're looking for. They discover that the piece is already on a ship that's heading out of the Chesapeake and to a city called Nagspeak, which is also the setting for Greenglass House. This is a fictional town, although I hate admitting it's fictional because it feels very real to me, but a really sort of oddball town in which it's the kind of place where odd things happen and it's hard to explain. But it's somewhere on the eastern seaboard of North America, but doesn't really belong to the United States. It refers to itself as a sovereign city. So that's where their piece is headed. And along the way, they nearly make it out of the Chesapeake, and then they get taken by an American ship. And the American ship, to everybody's horror, because they're right near the port of Norfolk, puts in charge their most expendable officer. Because basically the job is, we've taken this ship, here's what you have to do. You just need to point the ship at those lights and take it in as a prize. And so they put the expendable officer they put in charge as a 12-year-old midshipman, and all he has to do is point the ship that way. And of course, nothing goes well for him either. The French intervene, there's a mysterious ship that comes in, and so as a result, Lucy and her crew, who are now prisoners of this 12-year-old midshipman and a very small prize crew, find themselves all heading south and winding up having to run for the city of Nagspeak anyway. And so there's sort of a very uncomfortable truce between them, because Oliver, the midshipman, doesn't really have enough people to hold the ship or work it against the French if the French decide to intervene. Lucy and her crew, for reasons of honor and other reasons, decide that they don't want to rise up and try and take the ship. So they have this very uneasy sort of truce where they're going to get to Nag's Peak and then they're going to figure out how to resolve this situation. And it's a fantasy, so other strange stuff happens too. But yeah, that's the Left-Handed Fate. Let's see. What else shall I tell you about? I guess maybe, let's see.
So how much is it historically based and how much is it fantasy?
Oh, that's a good question. The question was how much is it historically based and how much is it fantasy? I do a lot of historical fiction and I really take pride in my research. So the historical underpinnings are as close to accurate as I could make them. The timeline of those first couple months of 1812, the background of what is following these characters in. A lot of it takes place on a fighting ship, so there's a lot of details of what life was like aboard a schooner and lots of sails and lines and rigging and so forth. And all of that, I hope, is very historically accurate. It's as close as I could make it. But the device that they're chasing is pure fantasy. And the city itself that they wind up in is very surreal and a little bit oddball and uncanny. So, and there is this mysterious ship that does not appear to be British, does not appear to be American, does not appear to be French that's pursuing them, and that is very much, there's definitely an uncanny element to the crew of that ship. An interesting thing about the War of 1812, when I go into schools and I talk to classes about this book and I sort of ask, okay, who knows anything about the War of 1812, and I always have to explain that the year it began doesn't count because that's, the gimme piece of information. And it's interesting because when I was growing up, I grew up in Baltimore, or outside of Baltimore, Maryland, outside of Annapolis, closer to. And a lot of the early set pieces of the War of 1812 took place not far from where I grew up. And so this was something that I actually did get in school, this war, but very briefly and not very comprehensively. And when I was in middle school, they also didn't teach us that we pretty much lost that war. The US at best fought to a draw with Britain. At worst, lost badly to Canada, which is another thing that when I go into schools in the US and say, did you know we basically lost, Canada trounced us, they're a little bit shocked about that. But even growing up in Maryland, basically all I remembered about the War of 1812 was the Star-Spangled Banner was written, Baltimore threw down and had a really good battle and knocked the British around pretty well. Washington got sacked, the White House got burned, and Dolly Madison saved a painting. And that's about what I understood about it. But it was a really interesting war, and I think it's a war that's interesting to look at today because it was a war that was set during this era where xenophobia and the idea that if you were from a specific place you had to be the enemy was rampant. Particularly between Britain and France. The US at that point maybe had a little bit more moderate outlook on things, if only because it was still coming into its own as a place that had all of these different groups that had contributed to the population. But Britain had spent so much time defining itself in opposition to France that there was almost no sense that you could be French and still possibly be an ally, or anything other than an enemy. And France had very much the same outlook toward England, and this had persisted for, hundreds of years at that point. So the element of sort of fear and hatred against people just by virtue of where they were from was very much alive in this time period. So it was an interesting book to write for that reason too, because it felt sadly relevant today in a lot of ways. And in fact, there was a massacre in France. This also takes place not too long after the French Revolution. And there was a true massacre that took place in France that was still alive in the memories of people then. It was really just about this particular area had revolted. And for almost a decade, the idea was if anybody still was left alive in that area, by virtue of geography, they had to be counted an enemy. And sadly, the forces, the French Republican forces that went in there didn't make allowances for women or children. They felt that children were going to grow up to become the fiercest fighters ever. There were stories about women and children of like age 12 who had, been combatants. So they really went in and there's arguments over whether that should be considered ethnic cleansing. So like there were these things that were happening then that there's just a lot of parallels between then and now. So it was really fun to bring it back to your question of the historical accuracy of this. And this was also a challenge because this book is essentially for middle schoolers. And so to try and address all of that, at least to hint at it, to raise the question in a book for effectively 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds was a challenge, but a fun challenge. But one of the fun things about history too, like when you're doing that, is to see how close you can sail to the truth of it without having to invoke magic to fix things that you can't necessarily reconcile in other ways. So where I brought the fantasy, and I hope that it's in places where it earns its keep and it's not just there to solve story problems for me.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about the fantasy?
Yeah, well the fantasy, all of my books are fantasy to some degree or another, and for me the thing about it that's always interesting is oddball stuff. So they're all sort of weird fantasy. The Bone Shaker has to do with a demonic medicine show that passes through a crossroads town in early 20th century Missouri, and Broken Lands has to do with the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, but also about weird card games and saints and magic systems based on computer programming. And it's sort of like, this is another thing when I go into schools and the question always comes like, where do your stories start? It almost always starts with a list of oddball stuff that I think is interesting. So for the Left-Handed Fate, it actually, a lot of it was the things that inspired the fantasy were early information systems. So there's the pieces that they're trying to assemble, without being spoilery about it because it doesn't really spoil anything, but like one piece comes from a jacquard loom, one piece comes from a music box, one piece comes from a recipe, a confectionery recipe. So things that were invented to convey information and to store it in that sort of time period during which we were figuring out how to store information and how to retrieve them. I remember going to see, there's a really amazing permanent installation at the Morris Museum out in Morristown that's all of these automatons and they have so many of them. They actually have a cold storage room where they keep the ones that aren't shown, but there's the wind-up creatures playing instruments, but there's also all of these really elaborate music boxes and things that allowed these musical instruments to play on their own. And the fascinating thing about it, if you look also then at the development of computing technology, is the extent to which we then adapted these things. The cards that powered jacquard looms or helped them to weave their the brocades, the really complicated fabrics, 150 years later would give their shapes and their appearances to computer punch cards. And so there are these really amazing little connections between the ways we've stored information. And so that's where the fantasy was sort of inspired by those things. And candy recipes, because they're weird and oddball, and the history of that is totally strange and fascinating. And the things that confections were thought to be able to do over time, which included not just to be a treat, often for usually people who could really afford luxuries, but also that they were considered to be medicines and they were things that could work miracles. And so you had candies like this famous thing called Manos Christi, which exists in all of these candy histories that, by the way, candy historian is apparently a job, which I think is the coolest job, like has to be the coolest job ever. But I would find all of these references to this really mysterious candy that nobody still knows what it is. There are all of these theories, and maybe it was just essentially marzipan in the shape of a Sacred Heart, and you were supposed to use it like a votive and ask for intercession from a saint. But there's also references to it being made with things like powdered pearl and given to royalty to cure these really obscure diseases. And so that's another thing that sort of plays into it, these ideas of these recipes that get passed down. And we even look at old recipes today that are not mysterious, miraculous candies, and they still read a little bit like code. So, those are the things that sort of influence the fantasy here. Also, Men in Black and aliens and stuff like that, but then that becomes sort of involved and harder to explain. So mostly the fantasy was inspired by sort of information systems, because I have come to realize the extent to which, to kids today, and a lot of them certainly understand technology, but the idea of the older elements of programming and information systems really do read like magic to kids who are accustomed to being able to just hit a button.
What is
A jacquard loom. So back in France, right around this period, maybe 30 years beforehand, they were looking for a better way to weave complicated fabrics like brocades and things. Like, imagine the fabrics that have those beautiful pictures woven into them. And this guy named Jacquard, who had been in the French Revolution, designed this loom that would take punch cards effectively, and it would tell. And so prior to this, people would actually be weaving those pictures in, like strand by strand. And somebody who wove really fast, I think, could do a couple inches a day if you were really, really fast. But this loom allowed for people to, it would essentially have the pattern programmed into the punch cards, and the punch cards were in this big chain, and you'd put them on this particular loom that looked like, I don't know if a torture device is the right description, or like this miraculous, like weirdo device. And so they put the punch cards on there, and you'd be able to manipulate it as a machine, and the machine would read the design off the punch cards. And so all of a sudden you wind up with this beautiful fabric in a couple of days versus, months and months at a time. But it was essentially an early form of programming, and the cards are your input and your output is this fabric. And Napoleon actually financed a bunch of Jacquard's work. So one of the things that the characters sort of put together in this is deciding that how likely is it that Napoleon at this point, when he was essentially emperor of the country and financing wars all over and about, concerned with conquest, that he would also concern him with finding a faster way to weave a fabric. And the truth is, he'd probably be very occupied with that because he needs his economy to be thriving, and this is a big export, but for purposes of a conspiracy theory in a book, it works pretty well. Maybe he wasn't looking so much to make fabric as to find something that would actually read. In this book, the cards came first and the loom came after, and he built the loom to read the cards. But yeah, so that's what it is. It's this loom for making fabric. But in a fantasy, you can make a loom. Fairly exciting.
What is the inspiration for your characters?
For this one, I was really inspired by the Patrick O'Brian, Aubrey Maturin novels, which are some of my favorites. And if you haven't read these and are at all interested in historical novels, they are so much fun. They take place during that same 30-year window. Like, it begins much earlier, during one of the, I think it starts in like the 1790s, which is just after the French Revolution. And it's a British ship captain, and he takes aboard a ship's doctor who also turns out to be a spy, and they have this amazing friendship. And Aubrey, the captain, is this sort of bluff, naval, stereotypical ship captain in a lot of ways, and the doctor is a total landlubber at the beginning and really has no idea what he's doing, but has nothing better to do with his life, and they become friends, and it's silly in a way that you wouldn't expect it to be, but it also is this tremendously great friendship. So in this book, the girl Lucy winds up sort of in charge of the ship relatively quickly, but then of course it gets taken. But so she's sort of the captain character in this, and she's very superstitious. She's a brilliant tactician, but not necessarily a big people person. She trusts her instincts wholly, but also has to figure out how to step into the role of commander at the same time. She figures out how to step into the role of captive. And there is the passenger that sort of hired them to take them on this whole quest is a natural philosopher, a kid who studies the sciences and has come up with this, is basically wants to build this machine because it was his father's life work, and his father didn't get to finish it. So he's the landlubber, brilliant in his own way, but not at all, guaranteed to fall overboard. If there's a chance for someone to fall overboard, it's going to be Max. And then the American midshipman sort of just seemed like I wanted this to be something where I had enemies having to work together in two sides, because that is something with this war. Like, the US had a really good rationale for entering it, but the world is not simple, and that war was not simple, and so of course it didn't make sense to have one side be purely the aggressor. Even the characters in it, there's two French characters who were sort of nominally the villains, but they're also not. I love writing villains that are villainy, and like there's carnage and the villains are terrible but also interesting, but you know that they're the bad guys and you're rooting for them to lose because obviously they're the ones that have to lose. But this book doesn't have that, and in fact for a while I wasn't sure how well I was even writing the antagonism, because I'm so accustomed and I desperately love having true, like, Cruella de Vil villain kind of things. So the American Midshipman was created to be sort of a counterpoint, but also he's this kid who also comes from a military family and wants to hold his own and prove himself, and just over and over the worst possible thing that could happen happens, and he throughout the entire thing is questioning whether this is all his fault, or whether he's could possibly be said to be making the best of a bad situation. But he's 12, which is another fun thing to tell students when I go into classes, like in the US Navy at this point, which had just really begun. We didn't have a standing Navy really until about 1803. And at this point, they'd just begun to sort of codify how people were going to join up and what the construction of a crew was going to be. And they had determined at this point, they thought that the optimal time to begin to step aboard a ship as a new midshipman was between the ages of 12 and 18. 12 was really pretty young, but Oliver would far from be the only one. But they really thought that 17, 18 was pushing it, because it was hard to learn the life of the sea and to learn your place aboard a crew. But in the British Navy, kids were entered into the roles and entered that they were serving as young as like 5 and 6. And usually they weren't actually going to sea at that point. That was usually like a captain had a kid and he had his buddies, and so he had his captain buddies enter the kid on their roles so that he could say that they were serving, because you had to serve 6 years as a midshipman before you could pass for lieutenant, and then your ability to be promoted and your ability to have a career would sort of take off. So they would get these kids entered on the rolls as young as 6. So by the time they were 12, they could actually be passing for, the next step up. Which is another thing that I think makes it really relevant to, the middle school kind of set, is the idea that, which is how actually the book came about. My husband, who had read the Aubrey Maturin books and really wanted me to read them, was like, you have to read this. This would be the perfect setting for a middle grade novel, because these kids would actually be at war. And they would not only be at war, they would be expected to take on responsibilities. They might be put in charge of a gun crew. They might be put in charge of a cutter that would be sent in to support a particular maneuver. They would actually be given responsibilities during battle. And I sort of said, that doesn't sound at all interesting to me. I have plenty of other stuff to work on. I'm not interested in reading these books. But he got me started reading it, and he was really, really right. One of the challenges less with young adults, so if Marie were here, she could tell you too about, maybe we could talk about the differences between writing for like middle school versus writing for high school, but it's a little bit, one of the challenges in middle grade is always, how do you separate the kids from the parents so that they can have their adventure? And the big trope, and if you can probably think back to books that you read at this age, is like, you kill off the parents. Like, that's the easiest thing to do, is you just kill off the parents. But one of the beautiful things about writing for some of these early wars is you don't have to kill off the parents. The kids were expected to be having these adventures functionally just as a part of living their lives during a time of war. And the kids in this book have never known a time of war. And in some ways, the kids who are reading it also have never known a time when, certainly the world wasn't at war, but when they themselves have been hearing about war that we're involved in. So, it turned out to be a really fun book to write, but also my husband turned out to be right, which fortunately he's not here to hear me say that, because it would go into he's heard me say that lots. I kind of have to fess up to that every time I talk about where this book came from.
Are there any adult characters in it?
There are, because they basically have to have adults, manning the ship. And most of the people that they're dealing with throughout the book are adults, but the primary 4, there's Lucy, her half-brother Lau, Max, the natural philosopher, and Oliver. And so they're the primary movers and shakers. But because they're assumed to be functioning, like everyone kind of, you know, the prize crews, the rest of Lucy's crew, they have to be obeying these guys because these are the senior commanding officers. So everyone sort of knows, like, we're the ones pulling on the, you know, and there's a lot of delegation. Like, there's a sailing master, so Lucy can say, all right, Mr. Wool, this is where we need to go and what we need to do, and he can figure out the sail plan and all of that, which would also be very realistic. But in the same way, when there's an opportunity to, like, overthrow the prize crew, none of them are going to move without Lucy's authorization, which turns out to be, I mean, and she doesn't, because of figuring, like, the one thing they have is they're privateers, they're not technically pirates, so they're going to conduct themselves in an honorable way. So the kids have to be able to function as adults, but of course they've all got these, you know, these same fears that, frankly, I would have at 40 if someone put me in front, you know, in charge of a ship. But, like, you know, trying to figure out at 12 and 13, like, how am I handling this? How much do I have to know and understand in order to be a good commander? What does it mean to be in charge? It sounds really dry, I guess, but there's a section in here where Lucy's talking to Oliver about what it means to be in charge of something and to command, and tells him, like, it's not about telling people what to do, it's about making sure that you have the right people in the right places and keeping the ship in your head. And it's all cribbed from a speech I got from my boss back when I worked at Williams-Sonoma and was an assistant store manager, and this guy is explaining to me, like, how you run a store, how you manage a staff. But it's not about, you know, so anyway, but yeah, so what was the original question? I lost it.
I asked if there were
Any adults, yes.
Yeah.
But it's basically these kids trying to figure out how to run you know, live that balance of, like, they have to function as adults, but they're children and they have all of those same insecurities and questions and things.
So what got you into writing?
I have wanted to write my entire life, at least since 3rd grade, when I was writer of the week at my elementary school and got an essay in the newspaper on our local balloon ascension. And one of these days I'll remember to bring it because it's pretty epic, except it wasn't epic at all. It was a 3rd grader writing about a balloon ascension, but I remember, like, in the interview, it's like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, I'm going to be a writer. And so I have wanted to do all of these different kinds of writing. When I was in middle school, I thought I was going to write songs for the boy band of the day, and that was going to be my big contribution to arts and letters in the world. And when I moved to New York, it was to write plays, but it turns out I was actually terrible at it. But neither I nor the people I was working with figured this out for a number of years, and so I'd been here for like 10 years before all of a sudden the opportunity to write the draft that would become the Bone Shaker came, and I have never really looked back. So I've tried all these different types of writing, but this turned out to be the one that took. And at the time, I didn't have any sense of what the age groups were or what it meant to write a book for kids. I kind of just dumb lucked into it because I wanted my mom to enter a contest for this age group, and she had this book that she'd been working on for years, and I found a contest I wanted her to enter, and it would require her finishing the book, and so we made this deal, and I said, all right, I'll write a thing and I'll enter it, and you finish your thing and enter it. And neither of us won, but it turned out to be the first draft of the Bone Shaker. And apparently this, either I'm fooling a lot of people or I'm not terrible at it, so I'm going to stick with it for a while.
What is the Bone Shaker about?
Bone Shaker is, this one is, it's set in a crossroads town in Missouri in about 1913, and it has to do with the mythology of the devil at the crossroads, which exists in cultures around the world, or at least something to do with crossroads folklore, because the crossroads is always sort of considered to be this place of peril, someplace where you have to make a choice, and choices are always dangerous. And so there's, of course, the story of the devil at the crossroads, and some musicians like Robert Johnson and Tommy Johnson, who supposedly made deals to become these tremendous musicians. And so the town where this takes place is a crossroads town, and everyone sort of knows that a crossroads is a place where strange things can happen, because a crossroads is a place where you choose. And then this traveling medicine show comes through, and stranger things happen, and the main character is the daughter of a bicycle mechanic, and the villain was really fun. And so it's sort of like a, I've seen it compared once or twice to Something Wicked This Way Comes to Bradbury, which was a nice compliment to get, just even to have that like whispered in the same sentence, but you wouldn't be far off thinking of that sort of tone. And then after that was The Broken Lands, which is the one about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which takes place before The Bone Shaker, but they're definitely related. And the idea with that one was, once again, my husband was like, hey, you should really watch this documentary on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, because you know what it was. It was formed this, it's kind of like a crossroads. And I was like, I'm really not interested in watching that documentary. I would really rather watch like Firefly for the 15th time or something like that. But I sat down and watched it, and of course it's a perfect crossroads between the East River and the two cities, which were their own places at that point. And so it did form like this crossroads between Manhattan and Brooklyn at a time when there really was a tremendous amount of upheaval. It takes place during 1877, which was the year that, oh my Lord, I'm losing my train of thought there. Wait, Reconstruction ended after the Civil War. And so in 1877, after this tremendous rift in the country and all of these deaths and everything, and then all of the years to try and fix what we had been broken for a long time and bring the country back together, in 1877 the US decided, well, we fixed everything, so let's just move on. And obviously we had not really fixed anything, and a lot of the things that we decided we didn't need to worry about anymore. It was a very complicated time. At the time I was writing this, I thought, oh man, there's a lot of similarities between then and now. Like, we had just had a contested election. We just had, people arguing that a lot of the protections that had been put into place to protect voters didn't need to be in place anymore. We were starting to see, or at least for the first time in my life, I was aware of discussions about gerrymandering and things like that. And in 1877, the U.S. government pulled peacekeepers out of the South. They overturned a lot of the protections that were supposed to have been put in place to protect voting. And so anyway, it was another one of those things that felt like very relevant to me at that point. But functionally, the idea with both of these Crossroads books is that since Crossroads is the place of great power, if you can harness that power, you can take over a place. And there's a character in this that comes from, there's a set of folklore stories, American folklore stories that involve this character called Jack, who's sort of a trickster character. And Jack beats the devil. Every third story he beats the devil. And one of them is a story in which when Jack is such this amazing trickster sort of figure that when he finally dies, St. Peter won't let him into heaven, and the devil turns him away and says, I'm not going to let you in, you'll take over, but here's a coal of hellfire, go start your own place. And so in both of these stories, there's a character who's sort of wandering through, looking for the right crossroads, whose power he can harness to start his own place. And it's Jack wandering through with his coal of hellfire. And so in this one, he's got two minions who are actually trying to take New York to turn it basically into Jack's personal hell. And in this one, Jack is sort of just running in the background. It's a different story, but he happens to pass through looking at Arcane for that. And then after that was Greenglass House, which is the one that had all of those lovely accolades that you mentioned earlier. And it was weird because this one was a book I wasn't interested in writing because it wasn't as much a fantasy. It didn't have an epic villain. The world didn't hang in the balance, but it turned out to be the one that, I don't know, gave me a career at this. And it takes place in Nagspeak, that same sort of strange town, but most of the strangeness is played down in this. It's a kid named Milo is the main character. He lives with his parents in an inn that mostly caters to smugglers because Nagspeak, like Key West, has a really vibrant smuggling culture that really upholds the economy in a lot of ways. So this inn tends to be a place where the smugglers go, but it's winter and Nagspeak sits on this big river in addition to sitting on the Atlantic, and when the river's frozen, the smugglers don't have quite as many opportunities, and so things calm down and the inn is right on this river. So during the winter, there's really not much in the way of traffic. Milo is Chinese, adopted into a white family, and running through the background of this also are questions that he's beginning to have about his 12, beginning to have about his birth parents, but he loves his family as well, and so he's never discussed this with them because he feels a little guilty about that and thinks that maybe that'll, mean that maybe his parents will take it to mean that he doesn't see them that way, and so he's been worried about bringing this up. And so it's the very beginning of winter vacation. He's looking forward to this sort of quiet time with his parents, And all of a sudden the bell rings, and it rings again, and it rings again, and all of a sudden all of these people have come in who are strangers, none of whom are really talking about why they're there, none of whom are really talking about what brought them there or how long they'll stay. So his parents bring back the cook brings her daughter, who's this little girl named Meddy, who Milo has never met before, and then Milo finds a map. And so he and Meddy decide that it appears to have been dropped by one of the guests. And he and Meddy decide that they're going to create this role-playing game to pretend to figure out the mystery of why these people are there. Because they don't figure there's actually a mystery. They're just going to, give themselves something to do. And then it turns out that actually there is something going on. Things go missing. It probably stolen. There do appear to be odd connections between the people in the house. And so Milo decides to, in an effort to get everybody sort of maybe opening up, he starts asking them to tell stories at night. And so over the course of the stay, these different guests tell stories, and he picks clues together. And it's a fantasy. There's a twist at the end, which should not have been a shock to anyone who read any of my other books, because I basically write fantasy, but turned out to be a really effective twist because apparently 5 people had read my other books, and then but anyway, but Greenglass House was kind of neat because it was this book that I really was not excited to write in the beginning. I had submitted it with like 5 other proposals that were set more closely to these other 2, and my editor was like, no, I want this one, and I said, really? It's going to be quiet. I don't know if I can do quiet. There's no carnage. I don't know how to evaluate what I'm doing if there's not some bloodshed. But yeah, it turned out to be great. It was a National Book Award, longlisted, it won the Edgar for mystery. It was nominated for the Andre Norton for fantasy. So, and was a New York Times bestseller and has been optioned for film. So we'll see how that goes. And as a result, I got to write a new one, which I will wave at you because I brought it, which is its sequel, which will be coming out in October. So this is Ghosts of Greenglass House. And basically, it takes place the following year, and it wasn't initially planned because I certainly didn't figure that I would, I don't know, it takes some effort to get a bunch of people to show up at a place and get stuck there. And in this one I had snow, and in the next one I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get a whole bunch of weirdos to show up at this house again and get them stuck there without it looking really contrived. But then I figured it out. And after that, the story happened really quick. So, so that comes out in October. I'm really excited about that one.
Is that also from Macmillan?
This one's from Clarion. This was, so this is my only one with Macmillan because they were the only people in the world brave enough to take on a book about fighting ships and weird engines and War of 1812. Because, I don't know why, like obviously everybody's into the War of 1812 these days. Why nobody thought that would be crazy popular. But yeah, this one is back with Clarion as the follow-up to Greenglass, which was also Clarion.
Well, Marie seems not to have faded, so
Yeah.
shall we open it up to anyone in the audience have questions?
Yeah,
Dang it, give me a minute.
it's okay, take your time.
When writing, it's like, how do you know, like, what category to stick it in? Because whenever I talk to different people about what I write, it's like, no, it's here. Never mind, it goes there, and what have you.
Do you mean in terms of age range or do you mean in terms of genre?
Both.
Okay, so age range is a tricky thing, and I've had, I think, Marie's acknowledgments, I read Winter's Curse last week, and her acknowledgments say that she had, but I think it was actually one of these other ones, maybe Shadow Society or Cabinet of Wonders, that when she started writing it, she didn't have a sense that she was writing for kids, wasn't sure what the ages were. And that's how I was with Bone Shaker. I had no idea. I think now, because both of those would have been about 10 or 15 years ago. So I think now there's a little bit more sense of like, we have, part of it breaks down to how old the character is. Like that's probably the easiest way to determine, but that's not always a perfect descriptor. But so you've got like, for like 6 to 8 to maybe 10, you've got like first chapter and beginning reader and sort of those sort of things. And then for upper elementary school, 3rd, 4th, 5th, into middle school, you've got middle grade. The middle grade is tricky because, and then YA is usually like 14 or 15 to 18. The age of the character helps to determine that because there is this pervasive belief, and I don't really know how true it is, but it's what is believed right now, that kids will read about older characters, but they're not super excited to read about younger ones. So if I've got a character who's 12, it's probably middle grade, and it's going to fall into that 8 to 12 age range. If I've got a character who's 16, 17, that's going to be YA. Where it gets tricky is if you've got a character who's like 13, 14, 15, because we don't have a good designation for that. Some places will take those books and stick them in YA, and some will stick them in middle grade, and a lot of people get asked to change the ages of their characters, so you don't have that weird thing. So that's where it gets tricky with ages, but age is usually a good guess. But then the other thing too, it depends on what things they're sort of struggling with. Like I'm trying to remember that there was a good quote that somebody sort of figured out or said that like in middle grade kids are trying to figure out which is it, because this is also tricky because I don't think this is always true, but like they're trying to sort of figure out how the world works and their place in it a little bit, but they're really trying to figure out how to function within the world that they're in. But in YA, they're trying to figure out the world and how they can survive in it long term, but also how they can change it maybe, and realizing that there are those bigger challenges. So I guess a part of it is like you could also look at middle grade being maybe more inward looking and YA being more outward focused. But even that is not sort of precise. A lot of it also depends on just like the feel, if it feels younger. But then this is a terrible answer because everything is kind of like it depends, but it really does. I mean, there are middle grade books like I would say the Redwall series is middle grade, not really YA, but those are definitely characters that are not equivalent to elementary and middle school aged in their world. And like Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, you've got a widowed mother as the main character, but that's definitely middle grade. And so it really just sort of depends. And in terms of genre, the good thing is you almost don't have to figure it out for these two categories because they shelve them all together. So, yeah, do you have a particular project that you're struggling with and trying to figure out?
Struggling and trying to figure out how to market, yes.
Here's the big question. Have you already finished it and revised it?
I thought I did, but I'm going through yet another revision.
Okay. So the good thing is that that's the only thing you got to focus on at the moment, because the marketing stuff, I mean, there are people who would argue with me about this, that you really need to know what, like, go into it with a laser focus, but I think a lot of times you don't necessarily know until you finish the thing. I am also, by the way, one of those people that will not outline unless someone like tells me I have to. So, but I do have a sense that sometimes like those things figure themselves out through the process. And also then ultimately somebody like an agent or an editor will have some input and be able to help you figure part of that out. But I almost don't think it's even worth worrying about too much until you have a finished thing. That
was a good answer.
It was a lot of it depends, and I hope there's something helpful in there. But I think
that helps.
Yeah, I think it varies.
And that almost sounds like the gist of the conversation you would have had with Marie.
Yeah, I think, and she probably has some, because she actually has done middle grade as well as young adult, and so that could be sort of an interesting. I would be interested to hear her thoughts on that too. I'm working on a YA at the moment, but I have because I'm so used to dealing with middle school age characters, I actually have like a very oddball sense of even whether, but again, like you don't know if you're doing it right until you've done the thing and there's somebody to weigh in, but it's a different sort of challenge, and I don't know. There's no magic in it either, so there's that. Like, I have plenty of carnage, though, so I know I'm getting that part, but now there's no magic, and I also don't know if I can, like, it's hard to evaluate. So I don't know, but I think every book probably, like, there's some struggle about that initially, figuring out where to place it, unless it's a sequel or really exactly like something else, and where's the fun in that? So if you're having trouble, you're probably writing something really interesting, is the good news. Yeah.
I have another... Are you done with your question?
I'm done with the question.
Yeah.
We had, and Emily might find this interesting too, because I know at one point we were in discussion with your publicist to have you and Marie come in for a Biblio battle. I don't know if you've heard about that.
No. What is this?
Okay, all right. Maybe they were volunteering you for it. But
they do that.
Amalia has done. every biblio battle we've had so far, Amelia has done. It's basically a competition, but a fun competition, where each of the participants gets up and within a theme usually talks about the book that they love the best, or would really like other people to discover.
Oh, cool.
And so Amelia's been with us for every one that we've done so far. And at one point there was this idea of having an author biblio letter. And you guys have been proposed for that, actually, by a host. But, so here's my question.
Yeah.
If you were to be doing a biblio battle, is there a book that you would particularly choose that you love as a biblio battle subject?
All right, let me think about that. That I would really love for somebody to find.
Let's say in the young adult category, or the middle age.
Or middle grade. Okay, let me think here. Let me think. So there's two, is it too big a cheat if it's like what books that are coming out that maybe, or should it be something older that I would love people to?
Make a plug for a book that's coming out.
Okay, because there's two that I got to read early. That one that came out last year and one that's coming out this year, and one is called Gertie's Leap to Greatness, which is no fantasy, just like this little girl who, she lives with her father. Her mother, it turns out, lives in the same town, but they're estranged, and she's really not part of her mother's life. And then one day she's going to school and she sees a for sale sign in her mother's yard. And so she knows her mother's going to move away, and she's never had a relationship with her, and she decides she's going to like get her mother to notice her and want her back in her life. And she's in 5th grade or 6th grade. She decides she's going to do this by becoming like the greatest 5th grader ever. And like her strategies for doing this read like something out of classic Judy Blume, like, or Beverly Cleary. Like, and there's scenes in it that read like the kind of thing I remember reading from my childhood. Like, I just think it's a brand new book that will be a classic in its time. And it was sweet and sad and but funny and just like a real kid that you could imagine running into. And I just think it feels like a classic.
Can you just repeat the title of the author?
Yeah, it's Gertie's Leap to Greatness, and it's Kate Beasley, and it's her debut novel that came out last year. And then other one is this book called Cilla Lee Jenkins, Future Author Extraordinaire. Is that right? And it's another one that's the same sort of age range, young. Again, no magic. I don't know how I got so lucky to read these things early, because I mean, I guess I kind of do, because they're like ordinary kids, like and she's biracial, Chinese and American. Well, she's Chinese American, Chinese and Caucasian, and her mom's pregnant, and they're about to have a baby, and she's trying to figure out how to sort of navigate this. Her family's about to change. She's having some of the same, not the same questions that Milo's having, but some questions in that sort of 12-year-old range that are beginning to, give her a little bit more time to think, like reconciling the two parts of her heritage. Her two sets of grandparents are not, like, have never gotten along really, or not that they're actively fighting or anything like that, but they've just never been friendly. And trying to sort of figure out her place in all of this before this baby comes and changes, the family dynamic again. And she wants to be a writer when she grows up. And it's just another one of those, like, feels to me like a classic, but brand spanking new. It just came out. And I think I remember there's a thing that happens sort of at the end where she has this realization that just, I remember sobbing uncontrollably, like in the bathtub or wherever I was reading this book, like just this incredibly intensely beautiful, heartbreaking moment that was just so perfectly rendered that I still think about it and get the chills. Oddly, not at all the kind of thing I usually read, because obviously, like carnage, villains, that's my wheelhouse, but these two books are
leave you one last thing unless Amalia has another question.
Yeah.
Speaking of carnage, how do you know how much to put in for like middle grade versus YA and what have you? That's
a really good question, and I don't know how I would answer it for YA, but I feel like for middle grade, it's sort of a similar answer to the question of like language concerns and allusions to sex and things like that. Like if it's something that is driving the story and is relevant, and then I'm probably going to include it. Like there's some fairly direct battle scenes in here that there's no punches pulled and bad things happen to good people. But I never want to romanticize it or dwell on it or play it for shock value or anything like that. Like, if it fits in with the historicism of it, and Lucy swears, Lucy drinks, like, not a lot, but that, you know, I mean, if there's no available water, she's gonna have beer. So those things, but I do want to make sure that it's something that's fully justified by the story, that I'm not doing in order to be edgy or, you know, or graphic in any way. I want it to be something that makes sense in the context. And that usually guides me to allude to more than I'm describing. But I don't believe in watering things down, and I don't believe in glossing over. So, but again, like, it needs to be something that's really deeply integrated into the story and that really makes sense, and that a reader needs to be able to read that and see, okay, see why that's there. That makes perfect sense. And I don't mind scaring a kid, but I don't want to deeply disturb them. But I find, interestingly, like, the places where carnage bothers anybody, it bothers the parents. In the same way, like, kids already think the stakes are life and death of basically everything. And so I don't think it causes too much trouble to them to encounter something that's unpleasant or frightening or troubling. But parents freak out.
Scary stories to tell in the dark.
Exactly. And can you, like, you can't even picture that book without those old terrifying, like, Stephen Gemmell illustrations. Like, no, absolutely, it needs those, and that's part of why they work so well, and part of why that book has been around forever and a day. Yeah, that's sort of how I address that.
Okay, so one last thing.
Yeah.
If you were to coach someone to go to a biblio battle, to battle for your book, what would you tell them they should tell them? For Left-Handed Fate.
For Left-Handed Fate, I think I would tell them the things that I think that make it really exciting for a reader are the weirdness of it, like the weird fantasy, and coupled with really cool history. I think I would play up, like, the weird, interesting things that are in it. These things like, you know, all those things that I sort of described before. The list of oddball, interesting stuff. But also that it has these characters in it that I think struggle with real things, and in as much as you can read it as just this great, fast-moving yarn, I think there also are some things in there that make it worth stopping and thinking about if you're inclined to want to stop and think about stuff. But it also is just, like, a really great adventure with a lot of weird, interesting stuff in it. I think that's what I'd go with. Okay.
All right, thank you, Kate Milford.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the great questions.